Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through His infinite mercy, His child and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, redeemed, His child and forever I am. His child and forever I am.
The Church of Christ in Canada welcomes you to our program today, Key to the Kingdom. The title for our lesson is The Unfolding Plan of God, Abraham.
It's such a privilege today to be able to visit in your home once again and to open the Word of God. If you were with us last week, I started to do a review. As I mentioned last week, because of illness, I had been unable to film for quite some time. And so I have been running some reruns from 2013 over the last 10 weeks. And I wanted to get back to where we kind of were when I wasn't able to film any longer because of illness. In reference to God's unfolding plan, that is, God's plan to save man, for man's redemption. And last week we talked about the beginning of the Word of God. We talked about creation. We talked about man and woman. We talked about the first sin. Talked about another major character in this unfolding plan. That was Noah, who faithfully served God and built the ark for the saving of his house and representatives of all of the animals that God had created. As we continue, we want to come to the next major character, and that would be Abraham, or as we first know him, Abram. His name is changed later by God to Abraham, but in the beginning, he's known to us as Abram. Let's go to chapter 12 of Genesis, because this is really key. What happens to Abraham is of major importance in God's plan. So Genesis chapter 12, starting at verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." So God here speaks to Abram, tells him He's going to make of him a great nation, that He is going to bless him, and that Abram is going to actually be the beginner of blessings that would flow to all mankind. That was part of God's plan, was that His blessings would flow to all in reference to the problem of sin and the difficulties. Now, we don't have time to read the different chapters that have to do with the book, or at least with the life of Abram and his good wife, Sarai. We know them both better as Abraham and Sarah. He lived an interesting life. One of the things he took with him on the journey to the Promised Land, where God was going to lead him and guide him, he took his nephew Lot, and that presented some interesting difficulties. I encourage you to read those chapters if you're not familiar with the story. We see that Abram is not a perfect man, because at one point he goes to Egypt, and while he's there, he tells his wife to say that she's his sister. He does this so that he won't get in trouble if somebody wants to take his wife or whatever, which is kind of a sad thing, but I guess we don't know all the circumstances, so we'll just have to leave that and recognize that though Abraham was going to be a blessing through which God would work, he was not perfect either. He was like us with his failures. One of the difficulties they had, both he and his wife, were the fact that God said through his seed, through his family, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. The only problem with that was he didn't have any family. He didn't have any children. And things went on for several years that way. Go to the 15th chapter of Genesis. And here, listen as, again, we have this covenant with Abram that God makes. Chapter 15, verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Well, that's a great plan. That's a great promise. But Abram is an old man and his wife is an old woman at this point. And so they struggle with this. The time passes, they continue to struggle with this. It's one of these cases where Sarah finally decides that they need to help God. We run into people sometimes who aren't happy with what God has done or has planned or how He wants us to serve Him or whatever, as though we knew better than God did what would please Him and what would be good for us, actually. In chapter 16, look at that, chapter 16. Again, begin at verse 1. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Well, problem settled. He didn't have any heirs, and now he's going to have an heir. Except that wasn't really God's plan, was it? That wasn't what God planned to happen. And God had said to him, believe, be faithful, trust me. I'm going to be sure that you do indeed have offspring. And it would turn out that Hagar's son Ishmael would be a problem. There would be problems between Abraham's family and that of the maid servants. Well, God does fulfill the plan. Go over to chapter 21 of Genesis. And here, beginning at verse 1, Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abram gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son was born to him. Now, God had a plan. He was going to send this son, which he did. He was going to bless Abraham and Sarah with a child, which he did. And so things are back in order now. God's plan is continuing to unfold. Now, it's interesting that at this point in time, God chooses to test Abraham. Now, I said earlier, Abraham was like us. He wasn't a perfect man. He didn't always do everything exactly like he should have to please God. But boy, think of the challenge. Think of the test that God gave him. Go to chapter 22. Here, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here am I," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Now, the next verse is really powerful, I think, when it speaks of the kind of man Abram had become. You know, this is several years after he was chosen to go to be God's representative. This was quite a while after he had left his family and his homeland and gone where God had told him. He's now gone through the experience of having this child, and now he's being tested with the idea that he would give him as a sacrifice, a literal sacrifice on an altar. So look at verse 3 of chapter 22. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. So he's doing what God said. Now again, we'll jump to the end of that story and recognize that when the time came, when Abraham had proven himself by taking his son and putting him on the altar and ready to kill him, that God stopped him and indeed provided a sacrifice instead. Here was a great example of the kind of commitment that Abraham had. So we have now the heir. We have the one through whom Abraham's seeds are going to continue. We read the story in Genesis of Isaac, the son who goes to marry and is able to begin his own family. He marries and has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Now, again, it's interesting here because under normal circumstances, the firstborn was the one who would receive the blessing to carry on the family blessings and so forth. As it turns out, it was God's will that not the firstborn, Esau, but rather Jacob, who would be the one who would carry on in the development of God's plan. We read about those boys. They were quite different. Jacob seemed to be a quiet young man, well-groomed and so forth. His brother, on the other hand, seemed to be a little different sort, a sportsman out in the woods and so forth, that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with that, but that they were just different. The New Testament speaks of Esau as a profane man who did not value what he had and who he was in the sense of the blessings that should have come his way. But even in the things that took place, there was some deceit. Jacob deceived his father to receive the blessing in Genesis chapter 27. And it's interesting here because all of this is carried out, or at least he's led in it, by his mother, Rebekah, who wants to make sure that Jacob is the one who receives this blessing. And so, in chapter 27, Jacob gets Esau's blessing. This was the blessing that should have gone to the firstborn. That was the normal procedure. But it goes to Jacob. Now, the interesting thing is that once this blessing had been given, it couldn't be taken back. Even when he found out that in fact the blessing had not been given to his firstborn, but his secondborn, there wasn't anything he could do about it. It is of note, I think, that after some years, we're going to find that Jacob is sent off to go back to some of his family or his mother's family with the idea that he should not marry a Canaanite woman, so he needed to be sent away. And after a while, when he actually comes back to his homeland, he and Esau are okay, and they have things settled, and it all works out okay. But it's interesting that here we had, in God's plan, in this unfolding plan of God, we had things go not just like you would expect them to, but we have the second son receiving the blessing and being the one through whom the blessing of God would in fact come. Now Jacob, he was blessed with 12 sons. He had a big family, 12 sons. And but you can't say Jacob was the best father ever. Jacob was, he played favorites. He was partial to Joseph, his son Joseph. He made this noticeable by giving Joseph a special coat. It's been described as the coat of many colors, certainly some kind of an ornate coat that was special and different from anything that he had received before. And certainly nothing like his brothers had received. We have a situation where the other brothers are out in the field doing the work that needs to be done of shepherding and all, and yet Joseph is back home. And we don't know all the details in reference to that kind of thing. But at any rate, there was certainly some division. Well, that was bad enough, but Joseph didn't help that any. Again, if you go to the 37th chapter of Genesis, you read that Joseph, when he was 17, he had a dream. In fact, he had two dreams. And I'm not going to take time to read that chapter, but encourage you to do so if you're not familiar with the story. But in this dream, in these two dreams, in the one, Joseph sees he and his brothers harvesting grain, and the stalks that they had put together, the shoots of grain. We had the brothers bowing down to Joseph's. And that didn't go over too well. And then he went on, Joseph, to tell the second dream, and in that there was the sun and the moon and the stars, and they all knelt before Joseph's star. So even his dad wasn't too happy with that particular dream. But at any rate, this just added to the problem. And so we find, and again, interestingly enough, this is part of God's plan unfolding. We find Joseph going off to meet his brothers who are out looking after the sheep. And when they see him coming, they say, okay, this is our time. And they decide that they will put him to death. Well, that's what they discussed. But then they decided, no, we better not do that. But rather, they put him in a pit and leave him there. They're not going to be guilty of actually putting him to death. But then, while they're still waiting around for things, they see this group of Mennonite merchants, Genesis 37, verse 28 and following, who come along. And so they take Joseph out of the pit and sell him to these guys as a slave. And so away Joseph goes to Egypt. Now Joseph was a young man, and it would have been very easy for Joseph at this point to have just given up. But he doesn't. He has a conviction about God. He has a conviction about his relationship to God. He has a conviction about his duty to God. And so in chapter 39, we find him in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the guard of Pharaoh. He's got a really high position. And things are going fine, but then Potiphar's wife decides that she would really like to go to bed with this young guy and tries to seduce him. Joseph runs away, leaving his coat behind. And so when Potiphar comes home, his wife gives the tale that Joseph tried to have his way with her, and she refused. And so Joseph winds up in jail. Well, again, he's at the point where it would be easy to say, okay, man, forget this stuff. I try to do my best and I wind up in jail. But no, he continues to honor God, to serve right, to be the right kind of person. And he finds position in the prison, and he has a place there, and things are going not too badly. He meets two of the servants of the king. One is the cupbearer, the other is the baker. And these two guys have dreams. In the one dream, the cupbearer, he sees himself, the butler, sees himself back serving the king after 3 days. The baker, he sees birds coming and eating bread out of the baskets on his head. And so Joseph tells them the meaning of their dreams. And the short story it was good news for one and not such good news for the other. The cupbearer would be back serving the king again in 3 days. The baker would be hung and his body pecked away at by the birds. And it came to pass as it was. So when this guy's going back, Joseph says, remember me. And he said, I will remember you. Well, some years passed and he didn't. But then Pharaoh had some dreams. And then he remembered, because Pharaoh tried to get his wise men to interpret the dream. They couldn't. So the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And Joseph is brought in, and Joseph is able to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. These dreams had to do with 7 good-looking cattle and 7 lean-looking cattle. And the 7 good cattle ate the lean cattle, but they didn't get any bigger. And so as this dream is being revealed, Joseph is able to tell him that this means there's going to be 7 years of good and 7 years of famine, and that he needs to prepare for that. This is going to be devastating. It's going to be a devastating famine that will destroy the land if they don't make proper preparations. And so, who gets the job? Joseph. Joseph is appointed. He's right next to the king when it comes to power. And he makes the plans and the provisions to prepare for this 7 years of famine. Well, now here's where the plan of God really takes shape as a result of these individuals that we've talked about. Because after a while, Joseph's brothers come to get food. And that's a very interesting read. I encourage you to read that last section of Genesis about that. When they didn't recognize Joseph, Joseph recognized them. So he kind of played with them a little bit and made them come back and bring their younger brother, Benjamin, with them as well. Well, the long and short of it was, when all was said and done, the family of Jacob was invited to come and live in Egypt. And they did, in the land of Goshen. There were 70 in all who came in chapter 48 of Genesis, verse 46. 70 came and settled there. And this was the beginning of the forming of the nation of God that would be blessed first through the law of Moses by God as He led them to be the people of God. This was the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise that was made to Abraham back in Genesis 12, that through him the nations would be blessed. Now God said, I'm going to make of you a nation, that was Israel. I'm going to give you a land, that was Canaan. And then He said, I'm going to bless all mankind through you. And that is the fulfillment of God's plan for redeeming man. So as we come back next week, we want to open the book of Exodus and begin to see how this plan takes shape and is fulfilled through the work of Joseph and his family. May God bless you as you study His Word each day.
The way to life is the way to friendship, purpose, and fulfillment. The intro lesson of our Bible study is entitled, The Way to Life. This particular booklet gives an introduction to our Bible study that is free for the asking. Simply contact us and we'll send it out to you. The first lesson gives an overview of the coming study and has a number of questions to be answered and returned to your study helper. Following that, you will receive 6 booklets entitled God Has Spoken is the first one. This is Good News is the second. Number 3 is Knowing Jesus. Number 4, Born of Water and Spirit. Number 5 is The Family of God. And number 6, Live a Life of Love. Call us at 1-800-795-3522 or send us a note on our website at www.keytothekingdom.ca.
Reading how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, reading through His infinite mercy, His child and forever I am. Redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, His child and forever I am. His child and forever I am.